Hello and welcome to episode 20 of Answering Bart Ehrman. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at an interview that he gave with Alex O'Connor. And the URL for that interview is in the description box. And in this interview, they're discussing why doesn't Jesus say, I am God? Why doesn't Jesus say, I am God? And that's the claim, and that's what they're discussing. So look, what we're going to do, Matthew, is we're going to show this video, and then we'll look at the different sections that he says and, engage with his comments.
Great.
So here we go.
I am firmly convinced that Jesus never talked about himself as God. And one way to demonstrate that is to line up our sources of information about Jesus chronologically. And so I mentioned earlier that we have the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are called the synoptic Gospels because they agree in so many places in which stories they tell, the sequence of the stories, even word for word, verbatim agreements, that everybody pretty much agrees that there's some copying going on. Somebody's copying somebody. Scholars who've worked on this since the 19th century have said that Matthew and Luke both had Mark as one of their sources. So you had Mark as a source. Matthew and Luke copied Mark, but Matthew and Luke have a number of sayings of Jesus not found in Mark. And so most scholars today continue to think that Matthew and Luke had access to some other written source of information that they call Q. Mm-hmm. Q is a group of Jesus sayings that Matthew and Luke had access to. Matthew has some materials not found in Mark or Luke, so they say, well, that came from some other sources, and Luke has some material not found in Mark and Luke, so that's other sources. Okay, so you got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but you also have Q and M, Matthew special sources, and L, Luke special sources. If you look at all of that material, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Q, M, and L, okay, all of that together, Jesus never calls himself God. All of our earliest sources. Where Jesus starts calling himself God is the Gospel of John, yes, our last source. And so, to my thinking, you have these sources of information about Jesus. So I've just laid out six sources, 6 pieces of information versus 1. The 6 are all earlier than the 1. It seems to me completely implausible that 6 authors would describe the sayings of Jesus knowing that he called himself God and neglect to mention that part. Like that bit just isn't important enough to bring up. So I think it's completely implausible.
By the way, I should mention that you have an...
So that's the first point that he brings up in that interview.
Yep.
And so, what's his claim there?
There's a lot of detail. There's kind of 2 sides to it, isn't there? Because he talks about the source criticism side of things. We'll get to that in a minute, but it's all in service of his main claim that Jesus, the historical person, didn't claim to be God. The earliest sources, Jesus isn't claiming that, and then John's gospel comes along later, and suddenly Jesus is claiming to be God. That's the kind of picture he wants to give. We probably should fill people in with the kind of the source criticism stuff that Ehrman does. I think you've got something on that for us.
So I've got this diagram here. But people may not be familiar with this, but when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as Bart Ehrman pointed out, there's a lot of similar material between them, and this allows you to identify commonalities and possible sources and how they've been arranged and brought together. And so he was talking about Matthew's gospel and how when we read the gospel according to Matthew, we see that it uses a lot of Mark, but it has material that's not in Mark, which they call M or Q and Q. And Q is in both Matthew and Luke, but Luke's also got his own unique material, and so they call that material L. And so this is the idea here that because we've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we can compare them, we can sort of take a step back and look at how the sources have been used and how they've come to be in the final, in these final gospels, in these gospels. So he's starting off with that point there.
And what he says there isn't too bad, is it?
No.
In general, he's just pointing out that these three gospels have some material in them that's common across them, and some just trying to trace out kind of theoretically what that looks like in terms of where the common sources are that they use.
Yeah. Now, I do want to say he talks about people copying from each other, and I've heard Muslims use this as an argument where they say, and not just Muslims, but I remember one of my lecturers at uni using this and saying, they copied off each other, and sort of almost making it sound less authentic. But if you read the book of Acts and you read the letters of the apostles, you will see that these apostles actually worked together. They're not just people in separate places. They're people who were interacting with each other. There's a group of people involved in this ministry. And so, of course, you would expect to see some crossover and interconnectedness. That's not a bad thing, because there's this one group working together and going out on the mission together.
And they're trying to work together to preserve what Jesus taught and to spread it to others all over the place.
Exactly.
So you'd expect this kind of thing.
So you'd expect crossover and interconnectedness. That's not a bad thing. In fact, it's really good, because it allows us to compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke and to see what emphasis are they doing with their sources, and how reliably have they passed their sources on, because we can see, how did Luke pass it on? How did Matthew pass it on? How did Mark pass it on? And we can actually compare it. And so it's not a negative thing. This is actually a real strength of Christianity, that we can do this. Now, I'm going to give you an example to show you why it is a strength, because Muslims will often use this as a criticism for Christianity, and they'll say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and bring up this source criticism. But when you read the Hadith, the Quran has sources as well. So this comes from Sahih Bukhari, and it's talking about the Quran being collected. And it says that it was collected from the memory of men, from palm stalks, from thin white stones, and from pages. And a man named Zayd bin Thabit and others bring this material together and make collections. Now, I don't have a problem with that. And so you can see I've got the row of books there, and these are these collections of the Quran that they make. Now, that's normal. I don't have any problem with that. Where I do have a problem is that the early Muslims destroyed these early collections and only kept one. They only kept one collection. These collections had different numbers of surahs, different surah orders, and differences within the verses. Now, the destruction of these early collections means that we can't compare how faithfully they've passed on the sources. Yeah. Right? We can't do that.
The whole conversation Ehrman's having, you couldn't have. All we have, if that's happened with the New Testament, would there be one mega gospel, and we wouldn't even know what's behind it.
Exactly. So because we've only got one collection now, we can't tell what emphasis has been brought into the sources that we used, because we can't identify the sources anymore. Right? We can't tell how reliably they've passed on these sources, because we don't have different collections that we can compare to see how other people did it. So again, I just want to point out that this is not a weakness for Christianity. It's actually a strength for us that we can do this. But Ehrman's main point is that this early material that is outlined in this synoptic diagram does not have Jesus saying he's God. But that comes later in John's gospel. So how about we go back and
he elaborates on that. So go to the next.
Yeah, we'll see him elaborate on it. So
this very question of did Jesus.
So I'll go up to here. Here's the next bit we want to watch
as well. People might be surprised to hear you make this claim that in all of the synoptic gospels, we don't get Jesus claiming to be God.
Yeah.
Is this not the case in any instance? Doesn't sort of Jesus imply that he's God at certain point?
Well, it depends how you read these passages. If you think...
What kind of passages are we talking about that people generally point to in the synoptic gospels, in the earlier sources, that say, well, Jesus seems to be implying he's God? Because, of course, people will want to say that, okay, maybe Jesus wasn't walking around saying that he was God.
Yeah.
But maybe doing so wouldn't have been a particularly great strategy.
Yeah.
Maybe in order to have enough time to have his message understood by his early followers and to sort of conduct his ministry before eventually being killed, if he just immediately started claiming to be God, he'd just be killed straight away. And so what he needs to do is get the message across, get the important moral teachings, which are the sort of most important part of his ministry, and then allow future generations after he died to realize the truth.
Yeah, no, that would be a plausible way to argue. I'm not convinced by it. It's what I used to argue when I was an evangelical Christian, and so I'm familiar with it. You'd have to say that the Gospel of John's wrong then, because in the Gospel of John, he does claim divinity early in the ministry and throughout the ministry. Second thing is, it'd be a mistake to say he was covering it up so that they wouldn't kill him any earlier, because he's actually not crucified for calling himself God. His divine claims have no relationship to any of the crucifixion narratives. And so it's not that that's going to get him in trouble.
I think we'll finish there with that one.
Yeah, sure. Yep. Yeah, lots of claims there.
Yeah, lots of claims. So again, he's saying that the synoptics don't have Jesus saying, I'm God, but, it's in John that he does.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I'll get us going on this one. So the first thing I guess I want to say is that, Jesus does not walk around saying, I am God, but he uses the Old Testament language and the Old Testament categories. And what he does say is that he's the divine Son of God. And so we need to listen to what he does say. He says he's the divine Son of God. He defines himself in relationship to his Father, not just simply as God, but as the divine Son.
Yeah, I think it's a key point, isn't it? Like, we do need to let Jesus, the historical Jesus, define himself in his own terms. And that's naturally going to be very kind of foreign to modern mindsets. We'd love it if Jesus just said a straightforward statement or said it often, I'm God, worship me. Make it pretty easy, But he's not talking to us in our context today. He's talking to first century Jewish people on the basis of the religion and the scriptures that they know. And he acts and displays himself as the God of the Old Testament and talks about himself in those kinds of ways. I'm struck by the book of Exodus has a very watch and see and you'll know that I'm God kind of thing to it. And then, I'll do all these things in Egypt and then the world will see that I am the true and living God. And Jesus does the same thing. Watch and see who I am. And you see Jesus acting like God in very Old Testament types of terms. But he also, where he gets complicated is Jesus has a very specific mission strategy in the way he goes about his mission. The reason he doesn't just say, I'm God, or in fact, doesn't even say, I'm the Messiah openly.
Yeah.
I mean, with Jesus Christ, right? Or Jesus the Messiah, that's the central identity of Jesus. You read the gospel and Jesus doesn't want to openly say that either. So he's clearly got some sort of strategy going on here that we need to be receptive to. We need to take seriously.
Yeah, and look, we'll just take a bit of time on that because you've raised a really good point. Let me just get this up here. So not only does Jesus not go around saying, I'm God, he doesn't even go around saying, I'm the Messiah. Right? I think people need to understand this. Jesus actually concealed his identity for a time. So we've got these references here. After he heals somebody, he says, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for proof to them. But don't say anything to anyone, right? And then when he casts out demons, and whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, you are the Son of God. And he strictly ordered them not to make him known.
It's very explicit. He's keeping things back. Yep.
He didn't want to be known. Now, there's a time for this. Let me just check something here. So there is a time for this. So we read here. Let me just get up to here. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And notice this, and he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. So here it is. Yes, you're the Christ, the Messiah. And he goes, don't tell anyone. Now, that's going to change. And we see what the change is in the next verse. This is after the transfiguration. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man, which is the way he speaks of himself, had risen from the dead. So Jesus has been saying, don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone. But now he says, I do want you to tell people after I've been raised from the dead. And
it's a really important claim, isn't it? That Jesus' main claims about his own identity only really make full sense in light of his death and resurrection, especially the Messiah thing. It defines how he's going to be king. But in the sense people hear Messiah in all sorts of ways. Jesus is like, well, I'm the king who rescues people from death by my death on the cross and my resurrection to rule forever, and conceals it up to that point. He's got a purpose for it.
Yeah. So I think this is really important for people to understand that Jesus wants to be understood as the resurrected Messiah. And so he conceals his identity. And so, it's not just that he doesn't go around saying, I'm God. He does on occasion say, I'm the divine son, and we'll look at that later on. But he's actually concealing himself until he's resurrected so that he can be properly understood. Now, Ehrman says, why isn't it that the synoptics don't think this is important enough? I think his exact phrase was, it's not important enough to bring up.
Yeah.
Right? It's not important enough to bring up. Well, I thought what we need to do is now just briefly look at how Jesus does bring it up and how the gospel writers do bring it up. First of all, every gospel begins by quoting Isaiah 40, and most of them have Malachi 3. And this is, a voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And it applies this to Jesus and John the Baptist and says, Jesus is God coming and John's preparing the way. And then we've got this again in Malachi. Behold, I will send my messenger and he will prepare the way before me. And so you've got these two Old Testament references which are in the Gospels. And this is how they identify John the Baptist and Jesus. John is the prophet announcing the coming of the Lord, the coming of God. So it's really, really important to catch that. So what you're saying is the synoptic authors frame the entire Gospels that follow in terms of God has come to his people in Jesus. Yes.
That's the point. So it's the Gospel writers themselves don't agree with Ehrman's assertion that Jesus never claimed to be God. They think that's the fundamental claim. God's come now.
Yeah. So let's look at the next thing here. So if you're watching this, we're just trying to give you a brief overview. So Matthew begins with the virgin birth, and then Jesus is given the name of God with us. God with us. Jesus calls himself the divine son in Mark 12:35, where he's talking about, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But then he proceeds to talk about Psalm 110. So he's just talked about the oneness of God. And now he says, but hang on, who is the Messiah when he comes? And they say the son of David. And he goes, well, hang on. David talks about this one as if he's not his son, but he's this heavenly figure. And he quotes Psalm 110 about the Messiah sitting at God's right hand and says, well, who's this Messiah that David says sits at God's right hand and is David's Lord? And so Jesus is already identifying himself as this heavenly messianic figure. And so he just doesn't finish with, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. He goes to Psalm 110 and says, and this is the Lord, the divine Lord. We got phrases like this from Luke 10:18. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Well, that's an interesting phrase. I mean, that's pre-existence, isn't it?
It's very much like what Ehrman said from John's Gospel.
Yeah.
Yep.
We also have Jesus in Matthew 23. Therefore, I will send you prophets and wise men and scribes. Now, who's the one who sends prophets? I thought that was God, and Jesus is saying, I send the prophets. In Luke 5, verse 8, his presence leads to a conviction of sin, just his presence, in the same way that Isaiah had the conviction of sin when he saw the Lord. We have that same type of thing happening in Luke's gospel. We see that he calms the storm with the word in the way that God does. He walks on water in the way that God does in the Old Testament. He's the judge and the Lord over the spirits, the way that God is. Now, these are all references that I'm giving from the Old Testament, and then in the synoptics, he chooses who is saved. He's the husband of God's people, which is one of the ways that God speaks about himself in the Old Testament. Again, this is how Jesus speaks of himself in the Gospels. And he says that he will come in clouds, come in judgment in the clouds, which is the way that God speaks about himself. So I just wanted to say that, Jesus is, the gospel writers are absolutely presenting Jesus as the divine Son of God. And there are these phrases where he's saying things about seeing Satan fall and choosing who's saved and, doing all these godlike things.
So if you read Jesus and watch Jesus in the way he presents himself and in the way these documents present Jesus, it's very clear the synoptics do present Jesus as God and have Jesus claiming that he's God in ways that are actually more similar to John's Gospel than Ehrman lets on, interestingly. Yeah.
So look, we'll go on to the last section we want to watch. Let me just get this up here.
I mean, what is it?
Let me just go along to here.
The Gospel of John, things seem to change.
Yes.
What do we have in John? We have, before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah.
Now, to me, this is one of the most powerful indications of Jesus claiming to be God here. Do you think that when it comes to instances like that, and perhaps we should explain why it is that saying before Abraham was, I am, would be such a powerful statement? Let's do that first. People, you'll often hear in this discussion, Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. What's the significance of that?
Well, two things. One is, so he's referring to Abraham, the father of the Jews, who lived 1,800 years earlier. And in the conversation he's having with his Jewish opponents, they're saying, well, how do you know about Abraham? You're not even 50 years old. And he says, well, before Abraham was, I am. So on one level, he's claiming to have existed before 1,800 years before, 1,800 years ago. But the second thing is he says, I am. Now that phrase I am is a complicated phrase, as it turns out. Ego eimi, I am. Sometimes it just means, if somebody says, are you the leader of this group? Yeah, ego eimi, I am. It's his way of saying yes sometimes. But in the Gospel of John, it takes on special significance because Jesus repeatedly says, I am this, that, or the other thing. So I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection and the life. These I am sayings are very important because every one of them is indicating that he's the one who brings salvation, that he has the power to bring salvation. But in this particular case, in John 8:58, when he says before Abraham was, I am, he doesn't say I am something else. I am. That's significant because in the Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 3, where Moses is being told by God to go to the Israelites and tell them that they're going to be set free and go to Pharaoh and demand that he lets his people go. He says, well, if they ask me, what's your name? What am I supposed to say? And God replies, I am. Tell them I am has sent you. And so that comes to be taken as the basis for the name of God, I am. And so if Jesus says, I am, and he's referring to himself. He seems to be claiming the name of God from the name of Yahweh in the Old Testament. And so his Jewish opponents take up stones to stone him to death.
Yeah, it may seem a little far-fetched to a modern reader that this is the claim embedded within that statement, but that phrase "I am" is hugely significant in the Old Testament, and it does seem that in the narrative of John's Gospel, this is what this is what people interpret him as trying to claim.
They do, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So the question is, firstly, do you think, if this is an accurate account of what Jesus said, that that's what he was doing? And secondly, do you think that it is an accurate account of something that Jesus said?
Well, I'll do the second first. I don't think there's any way it's an accurate account. I mean, if Jesus was going around claiming the name of God for himself, as in the Gospel of John, then he wouldn't have survived. He would have been stoned to death. I mean, it wouldn't have been legal for them to stone him. They would have stoned him probably. But the other thing is, if he had been doing that, why is it that all these other earlier sources just didn't think it was important enough to mention that bit? I mean, just beyond belief, I think, that these other early authors, including not just these gospel authors, but Paul tells us a lot about Christ, and certainly understands Christ in some sense to be a divine being. He never indicates that Jesus called himself God. If Paul knew he called himself God, you'd think he'd say it. Maybe he wouldn't. But I mean, so my point is that all the earlier materials say nothing about this. Our final gospel, sometime near the end of the first century, what is this, like 65, 70 years after Jesus' death, finally he's saying these things. Well, it seems unlikely that everybody earlier doesn't say anything about it.
Yeah, so...
So we've lost sound.
Okay, so Bart is saying there. Well, sorry, Alex has brought up the "I am" statement in John's Gospel, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am," and Bart gives us a good explanation.
I think so.
Of what it means, that's one of the names of God.
Yep.
But his point is again that. Well, he says, Jesus didn't say this because if he did, they would have wanted to stone him.
Which is what they tried to do.
Which, ironically, when you read the Gospel of John, that's what they tried to do. So he says, if he said that, they would have stoned him. Well, that's what, we agree. And he would have to evade that.
And it was implied in a lot of the verses that you went through earlier that Jesus often, he presents himself as God, and he says it in ways which kind of have plausible deniability, or there's a kind of a weaker version of the claim and a stronger version of the claim. In some contexts, it becomes very clear what he's claiming, like the one that Ehrman talks about there, where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." That's a little bit too overt. You can't get away with that one and just say, I was just saying I am in some other sense. But he says it in lots of other ways that it's very clear that he meant that he is God.
And again, I want to point out for the viewer that Jesus, we need to listen to what he does say. And what he does say is, I am the divine Son of God.
Yeah.
That's what he does say. So John chapter 5, I'm the divine Son of God. I do what the Father shows me, and everything the Father does, he does through me. Yeah. And so, Jesus is saying it, but he's saying it in his way, not in Bart Ehrman's way, right?
That's it. Yeah.
Now, I want to just call him out on something here as well, because he's creating the impression that in John, Jesus is going around saying it openly, whereas in the synoptics, he's not. But I'll just bring this up.
So we've already established that he's kind of he holds back on saying his messiahship and his divinity in the synoptics. Ehrman's trying to present like John's gospel. He just is overtly, I am God, I am God.
He's overtly. But just have a look at this. So the Jews gathered around him and said, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Jesus answered them, I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness to me. So again, there's this, tell us plainly. And what does he do? He says, have a look at the works that I do.
Watch and see. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's, tell us plainly. His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered these things had been written about him and had been done to him. So again, in John's gospel, it's got the disciples not understanding, things are concealed for them.
Yep.
Jesus answered him, what I am doing, you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. Yep. And so my point there is just that, even in John's gospel, there's a concealing until after the resurrection. It's not just that the synoptics have this. John has it as well.
It's really important.
Yeah. He's trying to contrast things that really shouldn't be contrasted. But I want to say that we've already seen that Jesus does make I am type of statements. So when he says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, that's a pre-existent type statement in the synoptics. When he talks about, I will send the prophets, go up to a bunch of Jews, a group of Jews in Jesus' day and say, I will send the prophets, right? Well, what are you claiming? That's in Matthew. But then the one I wanted to show us was this one, because there is an I am statement in Mark. This is after Jesus has been walking on the water towards his disciples. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart. And the Greek is ego eimi.
Same phrase. Yep.
It's the same phrase. And so you could equally translate that, take heart, I am, do not be afraid. Now, most translators will translate it as it is I, but it's just the phrase, it's just the Greek, I am. So, he may well be using an I am statement in Mark's gospel. And then, as we pointed out before, in Mark chapter 12, he refers to Psalm 110 to show that the heavenly Son who has come, the Messiah is the heavenly Son who has come, this divine figure. And then I think the last point we wanted to bring up was when Bart says, why doesn't Paul say this? Why doesn't Paul say it? Well, do you want to talk to this one?
Yeah, so from the Old Testament, the Shema, the Lord your God is one, and is something that is alluded to by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 8, except suddenly the Lord Jesus is included in it, which is either entirely blasphemous or Paul, the Jewish believer in the God of the Old Testament, believes that Jesus Christ is divine. Yet for us, there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. So you've clearly got this identity now with the confession of the one God of the Old Testament, with Jesus, the one Lord, through whom all things exist. We've got the divinity of Jesus very clearly expressed in this kind of, it's a Christianized Old Testament confession statement, if you like.
Yes. Yeah, and so you've actually got Jesus included in the Shema, and you've got Jesus included in the act of creation. And so, Bart Ehrman, and we could also look at Philippians 2, where he says, Jesus being in the very form of God did not consider equality with God. So, and that's an early source. So, but the point is, we've showed plenty of references from the synoptics and from the writings of the apostles, the Apostle Paul, which are all early, right?
Yeah.
Bart Ehrman says they're all early, but they're all attesting to Jesus being God. Okay.
Yeah, and there isn't this big. So Ehrman wants to paint a big gap between the synoptic gospels and John's gospels, who really demonstrated they're giving the same picture. Jesus does express in both that he's God very clearly in his own terms, but he has a strategy of concealment in both. And so he isn't overt about these, same as he isn't overt about his messiahship until his death and resurrection, until after those things, because that's where it becomes clear who he is. That's when he can just be outwardly straightforward about it and declare that to the whole world.
Yeah. Well, look, we'll finish up there. And hopefully that's helped you and, given you some insight into some of the issues that are around there. So please come and join us next week, where we're going to be looking at the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke and looking at what Bart says there. So we'll be returning back to his book, Jesus Interrupted, and looking at that topic. So we will see you then. Bye.